There was a little boy playing in a sandbox. And he was there in his sandbox, and he was digging around, and he was making little roads and driving his cars around and those kinds of things. And as he was digging in his sandbox, he came across a rock, a big rock, that he couldn't really move it. He started pulling on it, and I don't know why it was in his sandbox, but it was like it was in the way. And so he's trying to move it. The whole time his dad's standing over here watching him. And just kind of watching his son, seeing what he's doing, and then he sees him get the rock and try and start, and he's wanting to see what he's going to do about that rock. And so the kid, he's there, and he's trying, he gets around and pushes and he pulls. He cannot move this rock. And so finally, he knows his dad is standing over there. And he turns and says, "Dad, I need some help." And the dad comes over and moves the rock, and everything's fine. But the thing is as he was digging and he was trying to move that rock was just too big for him. Moving it was a task that was much bigger than he was. It was something greater than he was able to do. But at the same time, he knew who was able to move that rock. And so he called on his dad for help. He knew the help was there. Now this morning I want to ask this question. What is the big rock in your life right now? And how are you dealing with it? Are you trying all on your own to move that rock? You're pushing, you're pulling, you're doing everything you can, and it just won't budge? Or are you looking to Jesus? Are you turning to God to say, "Help"? The thing is there will always be things in your life that are bigger than you. But as a follower of Jesus, you also always have Jesus. And today we're going to see how this plays out in the life of the disciples and how it plays out in our own lives. So first, the disciples were sent on a mission that was bigger than them. But you also have a mission that's bigger than you. Let's look at verse 7. Chapter 6, starting in verse 7, 7 through 13. It says, "And he called the 12," talking about Jesus, "and he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, 'Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them.' So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them." And so Jesus has been teaching the people. He's been going around, he's been teaching the people, he's been healing people, and he's been casting out demons. And we've seen that, but now he is sending out his disciples to do the same thing. You see, when Jesus is doing this, he's going to extend the reach of his own ministry. He is sending them out to continue or further Jesus' own mission. And so he's sending them out to do this. But I want you to notice how Jesus sent them out. And there's 4 things I want to point out. So how did he send them? First of all, he sent them to go in faith. You notice it says that he charged them, which is the same way you could say he commanded them. This was not a suggestion. He wasn't saying, "Well, you might think about going this way. You might think about not taking these things." No, he charged them. He commanded them to go this way. To take nothing but what they were wearing and their staff, basically. You see, he told them, you don't take a suitcase. You don't take food with you. You don't even take money. Now, how many of you have taken a trip and not taken any of those things with you? Well, probably not on purpose anyways, if you have. But he says, don't take any of those things. No extra clothes, no bag, no suitcase, no money. Now, you hear this, and this could almost sound a little irresponsible, couldn't it? Because when you go on a trip, you take these things, you prepare for it. But I'm going to tell you it's not irresponsible for two reasons. First, a very practical reason. In that culture, when people traveled and they would go to a town, it was not uncommon, or it was actually socially expected, that somebody would invite strangers in to their house and let them stay there. It was it was just what you did. But beyond that, this was especially true of traveling teachers. If a rabbi came to your town, someone would invite them in to stay at their house. And so they could expect this kind of reception from someone. But the other reason why this is not responsible is because Jesus is teaching them to trust God. You see, they have to go in faith. They have to believe that God is going to provide for their needs. And this is why also he tells them, whoever invites you into their home, you stay there. And that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about just coming in for a meal or something. He's talking about staying there, like overnight or for however long they were in town. So whoever invites you in, you stay there. And when he says stay there, he's saying don't shop around for the best deal. Who has the best food? Who has the nicest rooms? He's saying you're not in this for your own gain. You don't go looking for whatever is better. You say okay to someone and you stay there and find out it's not the nicest accommodations and I want the 4-star. And they just invited me. No, he says you stay put. But at the same time, you are trusting God that he is going to provide for you. But I want you to notice in these things, when Jesus says don't take money, don't take extra clothes, when you go to a house, stay there. This isn't just a short weekend or day trip. He's sending them out for a while. We don't know how long, but this is an extended trip. They're going to be gone for a while. So they're going out to do this ministry. And as they do it, they have to trust God to provide for them. So he sends them out in faith. The second thing is he sends them out with a message. Now this message is the same message that Jesus has been teaching. The kingdom is near and you need to repent and believe. And Jesus tells them now, if they reject your message, what are you to do? You move on. You go. But he uses this illustration. He basically says, shake the dust off your feet. Shake the dust off your feet as you're leaving. So if you're leaving, you stop at the edge of the town and shake the dust off your feet. Now, there's a reason for this. And why? Jesus tells us, as a testimony against them. What you're doing when you do that is you're implying you're not even taking the dust from that place with you. You see, this place is so not good. What they have done is so wrong that you don't want any of it with you. So you're leaving even the dust from your feet there in town, not taking any of it with you. Now the thing is Jews would do this when they were leaving an unclean Gentile area. So when they were in an area that was basically predominantly Gentile, and they were in a place where they didn't obey God, and they weren't doing the things that God had prescribed, and they left that area, they would shake the dust off their feet as a way of saying, I'm leaving all of this uncleanness behind me. Probably didn't make the Gentiles feel real good, but that's what they did. I'm leaving it all behind me. But Jesus here tells his disciples to do this when they leave a town that has rejected their message. And when they do this, I think it would get the Jews' attention. Because just as the Jews would do it to disassociate with the Gentiles, the disciples are now doing it to disassociate with that town. And to say, basically, when the Jews would see the disciples do this, I think it would make the Jews of the town think, are we acting like Gentiles? Or they're suggesting we're acting like Gentiles. They're suggesting we're acting like unclean people. They're suggesting we're acting like people who don't obey or listen to God. And so when they did this, it would be saying that the disciples had fulfilled their responsibility in sharing the truth of God. But now the people who had rejected that message, the responsibility is all on them because they heard it and they turned it down. And those people will have to answer to God. And I think Jesus is telling them to do this because it may cause those people to rethink their decision, to rethink what they have their rejection of Jesus, or their rejection of the message of Jesus. And they may decide to then seek the truth. So Jesus sends them in faith. He sends them with a message. And the third thing is very simple. He sends them in pairs. We're told that he sent them out 2 by 2. Now, the reason for this is very simple. One, they can support each other. You're not there all out by yourself. And not only that, they can back up each other's message. And in the Old Testament and in Jewish culture, how many witnesses did you have to have a legal testimony? 2 or more. And so here you had 2 people who were going out with this message. It wasn't one guy just showing up and saying, hey, I got to tell you about this guy, Jesus. But it was 2 people coming and saying, the miracles he's done, the things he's done, let me tell you about Jesus. And so they were able to confirm each other's message and back each other up. So he sent them out in pairs. And the fourth thing, and this is an important one, Jesus sent them out with his authority. Now we've seen, as we've read through Mark, we've seen the power and the authority of Jesus. How he cast out demons, how he healed people, how he even brought people back from the dead. We've seen the power and the authority of Jesus. But now we're told that Jesus is able to give that authority to his disciples to use. Now I want you to imagine this for a minute. Let's say you have some kind of skill, whatever your skill is, like if you can do woodworking, or you can play an instrument, or you're just really good at math, and you have somebody that you've been teaching, and you know what, their skill level is nowhere near yours, and you're going to send them out to do a job, and it's going to require skill that's greater than what they have. They really need to have your kind of skill. Now imagine for the minute if you were able to then say, okay, I'm going to give you all my ability. Do it. Go. And they go out and they are able to do it with the same level of skill as you. This is kind of the idea what we see here. The disciples, are they able to heal people? No. Are they able to cast out demons on their own? No. But does Jesus give them the ability to do it? Yes. And so he gives them his authority, his power to go out and to do these things. And so he sends them out to cast out demons, to heal people, to do everything just like Jesus was doing. He gave them the ability, he gave them the authority to do it. And they did. And so Jesus now and the 6 pairs of disciples have gone out all over the place. And they're in different places. This isn't everyone, Jesus and his disciples saying, okay, let's go to this town. No, he sent them out. So they're spread out all over the place. And they're in these different towns and different places. And they're all doing this. They're all teaching the message. And they're all telling people to repent. And they're doing miracles, healing people, casting out demons. And then this happens. Look in verse 14 through 16. It says, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said he is Elijah, and others said he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. And so all this activity of the disciples is causing a stir. It's causing a commotion. It's catching people's attention. And because the disciples are doing these miraculous things and saying it's because of Jesus, they're all pointing back to Jesus. Everyone's talking about Jesus. And so as they do these things, they're like, what's going on here? So people are talking about Jesus, and there's different things, different ideas that they have about Jesus. And it says some of them thought he was John the Baptist. Now, why would people think that Jesus might be John the Baptist? There were some similarities. For example, they both preached boldly. They both preached and taught outside of town. They both were about the same age, and they both were not associated with some major or with any religious group within Judaism. They were out doing their own thing. And so some people assume, well, it's John the Baptist, raised from the dead. Some people say, well, it's Elijah. Now, why would they think Elijah? Because Elijah died many years before. Or excuse me, Elijah never died. Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind of fire, a chariot, many years before. Well, Malachi, the prophet, the very last book of the Old Testament, had promised that Elijah would return. Of course, we know Jesus says that John the Baptist was Elijah, or that John came in the spirit of Elijah. And so he fulfilled that prophecy. Well, then there's others who say, well, it's some other prophet. And the thing is that the Jews, they hadn't seen a prophet for a while. And so they would see the things that were happening that Jesus was doing and say, that looks a lot like the Old Testament prophets and the things they were doing. And so they have all these ideas about Jesus. But Herod hears about it, and Herod says, oh no, God has raised John the Baptist from the dead. Now why? I mean, Herod is he's feeling guilty, and I think he's probably a little scared at this point. Why does he care? Because it says, John whom I beheaded has been raised. He's afraid that God has raised up John the Baptist, whom he put to death, who he knew was a righteous man. I mean, Herod knew John was a righteous man, and yet he still put him to death. And then the following verses tell us the story of how that happened. And just real briefly, I'm not going to take time to read it, but real briefly, Herod was married to a woman who was actually his brother's ex-wife. She divorced his brother so she could marry Herod. All right? So it's a kind of a twisted situation. John the Baptist spoke against it. He said, you should not have done that. You shouldn't do this. She didn't like John. One night, Herod throws a party, and his stepdaughter comes in and dances for everyone. They all love it. And Herod says, ask whatever you want. I'll give you up to half of my kingdom. And so she runs and asks her mom, what should I ask for? Mom says, you should ask for the head of John the Baptist. She comes in and says it. And Herod goes, oh, now I have to do it because, look, I said that in front of everyone. I got to save face. And he has John beheaded. So he sees what Jesus is doing, and he says, oh no, it must be John. And I think Mark tells us this story here for a couple reasons. One is to help us understand the extent of time that the disciples are out there, that the news is traveling, people are hearing things. And we're going to come back to the story of the disciples here in a second. The other is to show us the impact of the ministry that they had. And the other thing is to foreshadow the death of Jesus. Because here is John, who has faced opposition because he was righteous and he was put to death. Jesus will face opposition because he is righteous and he will be put to death. Well, let's keep reading in verse 30 and 31. It says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they returned to Jesus. They report to him all that they have done. And I think they must have been excited. I mean, because they were able to do miraculous things. Things that they had not been able to do before and could not do on their own. But they come and they tell Jesus all that they have done and all that they were teaching. And we see here that Jesus had given them the ability to do a mission that was greater than themselves. Now, when I read this, I think of our own mission. We have a mission. It's called the Great Commission. Why? Because Jesus gave it to us, and it is great. It's a big commission. It is actually a commission or a mission that is bigger than me, bigger than you, bigger than all of us, really. I mean, what did Jesus say? Go into all the world. Wait, I'm on Matthew and preach the gospel. Yes, go. I want the Matthew passage. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. All right. So that's the commission. He said, go and do this. Now the thing is that is a big commission, right? I mean, we have a huge mission to go and make disciples of all the nations. And we're to tell everyone about Jesus and teach them and help them to follow Jesus. But we have to recognize that when we've been given that mission, that we also have a bigger God. And Jesus is bigger than any problem that we may face. I mean, we need to remember that before Jesus gave the commission, he made another statement. about his own authority. He says, all authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth. And then at the end of the mission or commission, what does he say? And behold, I am with you always. And that means Jesus with all his authority is with us. And that means when we're out there, we're doing our mission. He's always there, and we can always turn to Jesus and say, Jesus, I need help. He has been given all authority, and he is always with us. That tells us that our mission is definitely bigger than us. But it's not bigger than Jesus. So you have a mission that is bigger than you. And at times you may be given a task that's bigger than you. Look at verse 32. It says, And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went to shore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, You give them something to eat. And they said to him, Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, How many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they went and they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Now this may be a familiar story to you, but here we see this. Jesus and his disciples are trying to get away. You know, they haven't had leisure time even to eat, we just read. So they're trying to get away. It's a little time by themselves. A little time to decompress, to talk about what they've been doing. But the crowd figures out where they're going in the boat, and they actually run there and beat them there. And now, if this was you, what do you think your response would be? I'm just trying to get away. They won't ever leave me alone. Oh, why are these people always here? What was Jesus' response? Compassion. And he gave himself to them more. Compassion. Now, he says that they were like sheep without a shepherd. Meaning he saw them and he said they're lost. They're going around aimlessly. They need Jesus. He sees that they need him. And so he sits down and he teaches them. Now, if we were to learn to see people like Jesus sees people, I think it would change how we responded to people and the inconveniences that people put on us. If we saw them that they are lost, like sheep without a shepherd, and they need Jesus. So Jesus sits down and he teaches them, and it's getting late, and the disciples come to Jesus and say, Hey, send them away. Now, I don't know if this was just a purely practical reason, like, hey, these people need food. I mean, if they're really just caring about the people, they need food and it's getting late and they're not going to have anything to eat. Or if the disciples are saying, send them away so we can eat, so we can rest. I don't know what's going on, but they go to Jesus and say, send them away so they can find food. And what does Jesus say? No, you give them food. And the disciples, that's impossible. And they mentioned 200 denarii. That's a denarii is a day's wage. So 200 days worth of money. Were we supposed to spend that much money to buy enough food to feed all these people? And they basically say to Jesus, that's impossible. We can't do that. So Jesus asks, what do you have? And they go out and they find it. They come back and we have 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. And I say 5 pieces because we think of a loaf as being a large loaf, and the loaf of bread, it's a small loaf. So 5 pieces of bread, 5 rolls, and 2 fish. And Jesus says, okay, have everyone sit down on the green grass. I love that word. It says the green grass, because when I read that, I think, oh, it sounds so peaceful. It's like, let's have a picnic. But that's about what they're going to do. Jesus says, have everyone sit down. So they sit down on the grass, and they're all spread out there in the groups. Now, does Jesus seem worried at all? 5 pieces of bread, 2 fish, 5,000 people. He doesn't seem worried at all. Do the disciples? Yes. What are we going to do? We can't do this. They're like, it's too big. This is impossible. So why isn't Jesus worried? Well, because he knows that nothing is too big for him. So he says, sit down. He prays and he divides the food, and we find out there's enough for everyone to eat. In fact, it tells us that they were satisfied. And we're told there were 5,000 men. That means 5,000 men plus women and children. So there were thousands of people, and every one of them was satisfied. That means they didn't just get a crumb here and there, or they didn't get a little bit of taste. They had enough. They were full. They had what they needed. They were satisfied. And not only that, they went and they picked up 12 baskets of food afterwards, meaning they had more than enough. Jesus was bigger than the problem, right? Bigger than this task at hand. They had more than enough. So there's 2 things that we see here. One, after all the time with Jesus, after the disciples have been following around Jesus, they've been working with him, they've been talking to him, they've been learning from him. After all the time they spent with Jesus, and even after Jesus had sent them out and they had performed miracles in the power of Jesus, they still haven't gotten it. They still haven't learned. You see, their natural inclination is still not to have faith. Not to just trust God will take care of it. After all they've seen, after all they've experienced, after all they've done through the power of Jesus, their natural inclination is still to say, I can't do it. It can't be done. It's not faith. It's not trusting in what Jesus can do. It's not trusting in what Jesus can do through them. They don't turn to Jesus and ask for help. But of course we see this and we say, okay, well now they will, right? At least that's what we expect. They should now. Well, we'll get back to that. The second thing we learn here, or we see in this passage, is that you may be given an impossible task. You may look at it and say, yes, that's impossible. I cannot do that. And I think sometimes we need to admit that. There are some things, tasks that are bigger than us. And there are some things that we cannot do. But we may look at it and say, there is no way I can do this. This is way more than I am able to do. This is way bigger than what I am able to handle. But nothing is impossible for God. If you are serving him and a task looks too big, you go to him. You go to him for help. And he loves to give strength to his children. He loves to give wisdom to his children. In fact, James says, if you lack wisdom, pray. And God gives it freely without putting you down because of it. He doesn't say, I can't believe you don't know this. I can't believe you need wisdom. He says he freely gives it. He loves to give strength and wisdom to his children. That means all we have to do, we know that he is able. And whether I'm able to or not, we know he is able. We believe it, and then we act on that faith. And we go forward and we do it in his strength and in his wisdom and in his might, acting in faith. So we see here that we have a mission that is bigger than us. We may face tasks that are bigger than us. But sometimes we simply have problems. And sometimes those problems may be bigger than you. Look at verse 45. Immediately, He made his disciples go into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully. Let me stop right there. And so Jesus here, it's late in the day, they're all done eating, and they've picked up all the extra food, and Jesus sends his disciples away across the lake. And now I assume that they're going across the lake with baskets full of food in the boat. But anyways, they're there on the lake. They're heading across the lake. And then Jesus goes and he sends the crowd home and then goes up on the mountain to pray. And he prays. He spends time with the Father. But then he notices that the disciples are having trouble. Let's keep reading then again. Verse 48. It says, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. So he sees them out on the water, and they're still struggling to get across the lake. Now, it was really windy, but it had also been a long time. And I'm thinking it had to have been really hard. And they had been struggling against, the wind was blowing against them, struggling. Maybe it blew them off course and it was taking them a long time to get there. I have a friend who sails, and he told me the story about the first time he went out sailing by himself. And he was out on a lake, and he said it was going great until he had to turn around and realized that he'd been sailing with the wind and now had to go back against the wind. And he said it took him hours because of his inexperience. He didn't know how to catch the wind just quite right, but it took him hours to sail against the wind. And here he had the disciples, they're out there and they're straining to cross the water. But we're told here it was about the 4th watch, it was somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning, and Jesus sees them. Now, of course, when I hear that, I'm like, how did he see them if he's on a mountain and they're way out in the middle of the lake? It could be that there was a bright moon. It could be that it was the first light of the morning. It could have been supernatural. He was just able to see them out on the water. But he sees them and he goes to them. How does Jesus go to them? Does he go down and grab the boat? No. He walks. Which is that he goes to them walking on the water. Okay, so Jesus goes out there and he walks to them, and we're told here that he meant to pass by. Now this is a little confusing when we read this. He meant to pass by because it seems like he saw them and he was going to them, but then it says he meant to pass by. I don't think it means necessarily that he was that he was planning to walk past them without helping them. But this phrase "pass by" is a phrase that is used in the Old Testament to refer to a theophany. In other words, when God displays himself or reveals himself or shows himself. For example, when Moses was on Mount Sinai, we are told that God passed by him. And so it's an act of revealing. And I believe what's happening here, what Mark is telling us, is that Jesus was showing himself to the disciples. He was showing himself as God to the struggling disciples. And he was assuring them of his strength, and he was assuring them of his help, and that he was with them. But of course, when the disciples see him, they get scared. Why? Because they assume it's a ghost. Now, why would they think it was a ghost? Well, it was obviously something supernatural happening there. It was obviously something unexplainable. Because people don't walk on water. Right? Okay. People don't walk on water. And so they see this form walking across the water. Now we could also say maybe it was still somewhat dark, maybe it was hard to see clearly, but anyways, what we know is the disciples see Jesus coming and they're surprised, they're confused, and they're afraid. Until Jesus says, "It's me, don't worry." And he gets in the boat, and the wind stops, and everything's fine, because Jesus is there with them. Well, when this happens, what do you think the disciples do? Look at verse 51. And he got in the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They were utterly astounded. They were totally amazed. You see, so the disciples see Jesus do this, and they are blown away. It's like they can't believe that Jesus did this. After all they've seen, they can't believe it. And instead of going from fear to absolute confidence in Jesus, they go from fear to being blown away out of their minds like, I can't believe this. Why? Because they didn't get it. Mark tells us they didn't understand. And he says they didn't understand the bread. They didn't understand that Jesus is able to do miracles. They didn't understand that Jesus has control over nature. They didn't understand just how awesome, how great Jesus truly is. Even after they've seen his miracles, even after he gave them authority to do miracles, they still don't get it. And we're told that they missed it because their hearts were hard. Meaning that they lacked spiritual perception. And even though they were followers of Jesus, they still didn't learn the spiritual lessons that they were supposed to learn. You see, the bread was an object lesson to teach them about Jesus, and they didn't learn it. But you see, our problems that we deal with in life, they may be bigger than us, but they're not bigger than Jesus. We need to learn that lesson. Our problems may be bigger than us, but they're not bigger than Jesus. And if we go and we worry, and when I say that, I'm not talking about recognizing that there's a problem and saying, what am I going to do? But if we just hold on to it and worry and worry and worry rather than turning to God, then we haven't learned the lesson yet. Now, I think we could go around and we could all tell experiences that we've had where God has fixed our problems, where God has rescued us out of problems, where he has overcome the problems that we could not overcome. The thing is those are spiritual lessons for us to learn and to help us grow in our faith and to help us live out our lives by faith. Well, to reiterate the answer here, the answer to anything bigger than you is Jesus is bigger. And in conclusion, let's read just a few more verses, 53 to 56. It says, when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their boats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might even touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. See, what we see here is that many people knew about Jesus. They had heard about his greatness. They had heard about his great power, about the things he could do, the miracles. It was a well-known fact. And people came from all over. And many people believed that he could heal them. And they came to Jesus. And when they came to Jesus, he healed them. You see, they knew where they needed to go for help. And they went. They knew who could help them, and they went to him. And that's the answer. You go to Jesus. You see, you know where strength is to be found. It's with Jesus. And so the next time you're digging around in the sandbox of life and you come to a rock that you just cannot move, Jesus, you turn to him And you ask Him for help. You ask Him for strength. You ask Him for wisdom. When that rock is bigger than you, turn to Jesus. Ask God for help. If you need strength, if you need wisdom, if you need help, then pray. And by faith, you can have complete confidence because Jesus is with you. So you know you have a mission that is bigger than you. You can't do it on your own. And you may face tasks that are bigger than you. And you may have problems that are bigger than you. But as a follower of Jesus, you also know that He is bigger than you. And that He is bigger than every mission, task, problem you may face. And this is how we live by faith. When you face these big challenges, you know that He is bigger, and you trust Him through it, and you lean on Him. Because there will always be things that are bigger than you. But Jesus is bigger.